What if the very foundation, the way education is governed in America, was about to undergo a really seismic shift? Today, we're taking a deep dive into exactly that. A recent executive order from the Trump administration calling for the outright elimination of the U.S. Department of Education.
That's right.
We're going to try and look beyond just the headlines, unpack the claims made in this order, explore the historical context, the current roles of the department, and really analyze the potential consequences.
Yeah, the far-reaching consequences for students, families, the whole educational landscape.
Right.
And our mission today really is to sift through perspectives from, well, a whole range of sources, detailed analyses from Brookings scholars, insights from the NEA, even discussions you might find, bubbling up online.
All to give you a truly comprehensive picture.
Exactly.
Because this isn't just about policy papers or political talk. This is about what actually happens in classrooms.
Yeah.
It's about the support for students with unique needs and how millions of Americans get access to higher education. So this deep dive, we hope, will give you the crucial insights to understand what's really at stake here and why it matters to you. So let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Okay. Let's kick things off by looking directly at this executive order. It's got this title, Improving Education Outcomes by Empowering Parents, States, and Communities. And it's pretty unambiguous.
It is. It directs the Secretary of Education to, and this is the quote, facilitate the closure of the Department of Education, within the bounds of the law.
And the stated purpose, the rationale behind it is quite clear, too. The order claims that the experiment of controlling American education through federal programs and dollars has plainly failed our children, our teachers, and our families.
Right. The aim, as they state it, is empowering families, communities, states. It's based on this idea that the primary decision-making power over education, well, it already belongs to them.
It also really champions educational choice for families and competition for residentially assigned government-run public schools. It even points to, I think, over a dozen states.
Yeah, over a dozen states that have enacted these universal K-12 scholarship programs, kind of holding them up as promising avenues for reform, sort of implying this is the way forward nationally.
And when you dig into the order's justifications, the specific points, they often come back to cost and bureaucracy, don't they?
They do. It highlights, for instance, the pretty staggering $200 billion taxpayers spent federally on schools during COVID-19. That's on top of the usual $60 billion annually, much of which is distributed by the Department of Education, or ED.
And it gets specific, like pointing to ED's Public Relations Office having over 80 staffers that cost more than $10 million a year, kind of framing it as wasteful spending.
Exactly. And then there's the student performance argument. That's pretty sparkly put.
Yeah. The order asserts closing the department would help children escape a system that is failing them. It cites the 2024 NAEP data, that's the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the nation's report card. And it notes 70% of 8th graders were below proficient in reading, 72% below proficient in math. The conclusion they draw is blunt. The federal education bureaucracy is not working.
And for higher education, the claim is that closure would drastically improve program implementation. What's interesting here is the comparison they make.
Oh, the bank comparison.
Right. It points out ED manages this massive $1.6 trillion student loan portfolio with fewer than 1,500 staff in its Federal Student Aid Office, the FSA.
Which sounds tiny compared to
a bank like Wells Fargo with over 200,000 employees. The suggestion is pretty clear. ED must return bank functions to an entity equipped to serve America's students. Like a bank.
Okay, so that's the executive order's blueprint. It's vision for change, returning power to states, dismantling federal oversight. But, like with any big proposal, the past often gives us crucial context, right?
Absolutely. We need to understand the present and future.
Let's try and peel back some layers. What does the factual context tell us about these claims? Like, the order frames federal involvement as a failed experiment, but is it really that new?
Not really, no. And that's a really crucial piece of context that often gets missed. While the current Department of Education was restructured in 1979, under President Carter,
right,
the federal government's involvement in education goes back much, much further. A cabinet-level Department of Education was actually created way back in 1867.
1867. By President Andrew Johnson.
That's the one. Now, it was quickly demoted to an Office of Education in 1868, but that office existed continuously for over a century under various other departments before the 1979 restructuring.
So the federal government has been involved in funding and education programs for over 150 years. Calling it a recent experiment feels inaccurate.
It's a bit of a stretch, yeah. It frames the narrative in a particular way.
And what about that constant debate, federal versus state control? The Constitution doesn't explicitly mention schools, right? So education policy is mostly left to states and local governments.
That's correct. Traditionally, the federal government's role has been pretty narrowly defined. We're talking, like you said earlier, providing maybe 10% of K-12 funding overall,
Okay.
enforcing federal civil rights laws, which is a big one, and facilitating research and development.
And federal law actually prohibits the federal government from controlling things like curriculum, school operations, or staffing, doesn't it?
It does. Explicitly prohibits it, which makes some of the rhetoric about federal overreach interesting.
And let's dig into that student performance data again, the NAEP scores. The order presents them as near historical lows, but you mentioned that might be stretching things.
Yeah, it takes some liberties. If you look at NAEP's long-term trend assessments, they actually show gains in student performance from the 1970s up until, well, relatively recently. There have been some declines in the last few years, that's true. But it's also really important to understand that the NAEP standard for proficiency is set deliberately high. It's aspirational.
So it can be easily used rhetorically.
It can be, yes. So while those recent scores are definitely concerning, the leap to say the Department of Education is the cause or that removing it is the solution, that's a big jump.
Education outcomes are complex, lots of factors involved.
Incredibly complex. And crucially, there are no rigorous studies out there that directly link the existence or actions of the U.S. Department of Education itself to student learning outcomes, positively or negatively. Plus, remember, most of the department's spending actually goes to higher education.
Right, the student loans primarily.
Exactly.
What about the other point that teachers' unions have somehow captured the department and usurped local control? That's another common argument.
It is, but again, it's arguably misleading. As we just said, federal law stops ED from directing things like school staffing. Teachers are mostly employees of state or local agencies.
So their unions exert influence mainly at that level, state and local.
Primarily, yes. They absolutely influence education policy, but it's mostly at the state and local levels. So it's not really clear how dismantling the federal department would significantly change union influence there.
Okay, so we've looked at the arguments for cutting the department and some important historical and factual context. But let's shift gears. Let's imagine this actually moves forward. What would it really mean on the ground for students and schools, starting with K-12 education?
Well, one of the most immediate and probably significant concerns would be the loss of federal funding in specific programs. Take Title I, for example.
That's the big one for low-income schools, right?
It's huge. It directs billions in federal money specifically to schools with high numbers of low-income students. It pays for essential extra, supports more teachers, maybe reading specialists, supplies, even behavioral and mental health programs.
And a lot of schools rely on this.
A lot. Nearly 2/3 of all public schools in the country receive some Title I funding.
Wow. And the proposal, I think from Project 2025 specifically, is to phase it out by turning it into block grants.
Exactly. No strings attached, block grants to states. The worry there is a major loss of accountability. Money meant for, say, extra help for struggling readers in a high-poverty school.
Could get redirected by the state to something else entirely.
Potentially, yes. Leaving those vulnerable students without the support Title I currently provides. One analysis, I think it was, from the Center for American Progress suggested this could mean losing around 180,000 teaching positions.
180,000. Affecting nearly 3 million low-income students?
Yeah.
That's a massive potential impact.
It is. And just in terms of overall funding, even though federal funds are only about 10% of K-12 spending nationwide.
Which sounds small, but
it still adds up to billions of dollars. Billions specifically targeted to support underserved students. Without those federal funds, states and local districts would have to scramble to find replacements, likely leading to budget shortfalls and cuts.
And then there's the civil rights angle.
Yeah.
This feels critical for a lot of families. The Department's Office for Civil Rights, the OCR.
Yeah, that's the federal body enforcing laws against discrimination based on race, disability, gender. Think Title IX, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA.
Landmark laws. And the expectation is OCR's functions would move to the Department of Justice, the DOJ.
That seems to be the strong expectation, yes.
What would that mean practically?
Well, it could make getting legal help for discrimination much more complicated, more expensive, and just less accessible for ordinary families.
Oh, so?
Imagine you're a parent. Your child's facing discrimination. Instead of filing a complaint with a specialized office like OCR, which can investigate and mediate.
You might suddenly need lawyers, court battles.
Exactly. A much higher barrier. Many families just couldn't afford that. And it's worth noting the DOJ's track record on enforcing the ADA, for example, has faced criticism in the past for not being very responsive.
And the executive order itself specifically mentions targeting illegal discrimination obscured under the label diversity, equity, and inclusion, and programs promoting gender ideology.
Right. That language signals a pretty clear intention to redefine what counts as illegal discrimination, especially around race, and interpretations of Title IX's.
Which could undermine local efforts on equity or accommodations for transgender students.
That's the concern, yes. And we've seen signs of the administration being willing to quickly withhold federal funds from institutions like Columbia University was mentioned over these kinds of issues, sometimes bypassing traditional investigation processes.
Okay, what about special education? This seems like another area of major potential impact.
Huge. Absolutely huge. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, that's the federal law requiring schools to provide services for students with disabilities.
And it supports millions of students, right?
About 7.5 million students. That's roughly 15% of the entire student population. And it involves over $15 billion in federal funding annually.
What was it like before IDEA?
It varied wildly. Access was very inconsistent across states. Often, wealthier families had to find private alternatives, or students with disabilities just didn't get adequate support.
So ED enforces compliance now.
Yes. While states implement IDEA differently, the Department of Education ensures they meet the basic requirements. They can withhold federal funding if states don't comply.
And without that federal enforcement.
The worry is that some states might cut corners, leading to bigger disparities between states, potentially pushing students with disabilities into more restrictive settings, which goes against the legal requirement for integration.
And IDEA funding has always been an issue too, hasn't it? The federal government never fully funded its share.
Never. It was authorized to cover up to 40% of the extra costs, but the highest it ever actually reached was about 18%. So any changes now could squeeze state budgets for these services even further, especially if experienced staff at ED who understand these complex programs are lost.
Beyond specific programs like Title I and IDEA, what about just national coordination, standards?
That's another important role ED plays, even if indirectly sometimes. It encourages national conversations about education standards like Common Core or, more recently, ESA, the Every Student Succeeds Act.
Which replaced No Child Left Behind.
Right. It gave states more control, but still required accountability. Without a federal focal point, you could see states developing really inconsistent curricula. That makes it tough for students who move between states.
Yeah, that's a practical issue.
And federal coordination is also vital during national crises. Think natural disasters, pandemics. That response could become much more fragmented without a central agency like ED.
Okay, let's pivot then to higher education. The consequences there seem equally significant, maybe even more widespread in some ways, especially around student loans.
Definitely. This is where millions and millions of Americans interact directly with the Department of Education through its Office of Federal Student Aid, FSA.
And the scale is just mind-boggling. A $1.6 trillion student loan portfolio.
Yeah, for nearly 43 million borrowers, it's hard to even grasp. Like you said, it's roughly the GDP of Canada or Russia, all managed by this one office.
And FSA does everything. Disbursement, tracking borrower info, fraud, managing the loan servicers.
All of it. So if you remove that federal oversight, the big concern is privatization.
Meaning private banks taking over.
Potentially. Which could lead to higher interest rates, maybe less access to aid for lower-income students, and possibly even a return to some of the predatory lending practices we saw years ago when private banks had a bigger role.
And didn't you mention the administration's language about FSA was quite aggressive? Kneecap FSA.
That was the reported phrasing, yes. It suggests a real intent to reduce its capacity significantly. And we've already seen major staff reductions. The office staff nearly halved recently.
Which makes you think about the FC rollout this past year.
Exactly. The 2024-2025 FSA delays, the technical glitches, that was a very visible, very painful example of how major system changes, especially rushed ones, can cause chaos.
So doing something similar with the entire loan system could lead to worse customer service, delays, maybe even threatening students' ability to get aid or repay loans properly.
That's the fear. Administrative chaos on a massive scale.
And beyond the loans themselves, what other protections or functions might be weakened?
Well, there's the issue of expertise. If other agencies try to take over ED's functions, they likely won't have the deep, specialized knowledge needed for these complex, interconnected areas.
And ED handles so much more than just loans, right? You forget the scope.
Oh, absolutely. Pell Grants absolutely critical for college access for low-income students. Managing repayment plans, like income-driven repayment. Administering grants for science, research. Programs for veterans, for student parents.
Data collection, too, which is vital for tracking trends.
Vital national data collection. Defending students from discrimination at the college level. Overseeing accreditation, which ensures quality. And supporting HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities and minority-serving institutions. These are crucial for equity in higher ed.
So replacing that federal system with potentially dozens of different state approaches for things like Pell Grants could just shatter college access for many.
The phrase used in one analysis was seismic reverberations. It could dramatically widen access gaps for low-income families.
And then there's the concern about ideology influencing funding decisions.
Yes, what some call ideological crusades. There have been reports, for instance, of research contracts being terminated or employees put on leave for attending diversity training. It raises fears that the federal aid system could be weaponized, withholding funds from colleges that don't align with certain views on, say, critical race theory.
Okay, so we've laid out the potential impacts, which are clearly huge. But let's look at practicalities. What are the actual legal and political realities of getting rid of the Department of Education? It's not simple, is it?
Not simple at all. That's a critical point. The department was established by Congress, by an act of Congress in 1979. That act also gave it its specific jobs.
Meaning
Eliminating the department entirely or even just getting rid of many of its key functions would require another act of Congress. It can't just be done by executive order.
even the Secretary of Education acknowledged that, right?
Yes. Secretary McMahon acknowledged during her confirmation hearing that the administration can't just shut down ED unilaterally. Congress has to act.
So politically, that's a heavy lift. You'd need to get legislation through Congress.
A very heavy lift. You'd likely face huge obstacles, like a Senate filibuster. That means you'd probably need 60 votes in the Senate to move forward.
And Republicans don't have 60 seats. They currently hold 53.
Exactly. And remember, back in 2023, the House actually considered an amendment to eliminate the department and rejected it. More than 60 Republicans voted against eliminating it, joining the Democrats.
Although a new bill was just introduced recently calling for elimination by 2026.
That's true. The push is definitely there. But the legislative path, getting it passed into law, remains incredibly challenging.
But even if they can't eliminate it outright, executive actions can still do a lot, can't they?
They absolutely can. The administration can work aggressively to reduce the department's size, its budget, its impact.
Like the staffing changes you mentioned?
Right. Dramatic staffing changes. The staff count has already been nearly halved since the inauguration, down to around 2,183 as of March.
Wow.
They can also issue executive orders aimed at, say, draining resources from public schools via vouchers, or unilaterally try to roll back civil rights protections or replace career civil servants with political appointees.
But there are limits. Courts might step in.
If the administration pushes further than the law allows, yes, those actions will almost certainly be challenged in court. So it's not closure, but they can still significantly reshape and weaken the department through executive power.
And finally, what about public opinion? Does that play a role?
It often does politically. According to a 2024 poll, 58% of people across party lines did not want the Department of Education abolished.
It's a clear majority.
And over 60% of voters said they supported prioritizing education funding over tax cuts. So there seems to be significant public sentiment against abolishing the department, which politicians usually pay attention to.
Well, we certainly covered a lot of ground today. We've navigated this really complex landscape from the executive order's goals, the history, the vast web of services ED provides, to the significant legal and political hurdles involved in actually dismantling it. I think you've seen how this isn't just some abstract political talking point. It's a proposal with very real, very varied potential consequences for, well, pretty much every student and family in the country.
It really does highlight that fundamental tension in American education, doesn't it? That constant push and pull between federal oversight and state or local control. And the ongoing critical debate about how we actually ensure equity and opportunity for all students, regardless of their background or where they happen to live.
Because as we've explored, the federal role, even though it's a smaller slice of the funding pie, has been historically crucial for things like protecting civil rights, supporting students with disabilities, expanding access to college. So, maybe the provocative question for you, the listener, to think about as you go about your day is this. If the U.S. Department of Education were to be drastically reduced or even eliminated, what new structures, what new mechanisms would need to be created to ensure that every American child, no matter their zip code, no matter their background, truly has an equitable chance to thrive and reach their full potential? What does a truly well-informed society need to understand about the often unseen foundations that support its own future?